Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, June 22nd issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And I don't know where you are, but this first day of summer where I am, it is just pouring. So you might hear some of that noise in the background. Okay. The Deadly Rise of Giant Trucks and SUVs by a number of people. Michael Keller, Eli Murray, Danielle Ivory, and Ireneo Cabreros. For decades, American roads were steadily getting safer for pedestrians, but around 2009 the trend reversed. Since then, the number of pedestrians killed each year has risen by about 75%. The surge in pedestrian deaths has baffled researchers. Most other wealthy countries haven't seen similar increases, suggesting that possible culprits like smartphones don't tell the whole story. Other likely causes of deadly crashes, such as drunken and distracted driving, have attracted immense attention from the public and policymakers. But the trend toward ever larger vehicles has received much less scrutiny, even after federal researchers in 2022 cautioned regulators that it was endangering pedestrians. After analyzing federal and industry records, including never before examined data on vehicle dimensions, we found that the rise of large pickups and SUVs is an important factor. Our estimate is that about 200 to 400 pedestrians a year would not have died if vehicles had remained approximately the same size over the past quarter century. That represents about 30% of the recent increase in that represents about 10% of the recent increase in pedestrian deaths. There are two reasons bigger vehicles are deadlier. They have taller hoods, and they tend to have larger blind zones. Said Sean Harrington, whose company Forensic Rock conducted crash tests for us, we see a lot of devastating collisions, even at lower speeds, because the pedestrian gets punted forward. Before the driver knows what's happened, the pedestrian's head is under the wheel. More vehicles than ever have hoods that exceed the average American's center of gravity, which is generally around the belly button. The hood of an average passenger vehicle today is about 3 feet high. Anyone shorter than 5'6", about half of American adults, would frequently be rammed to the pavement. So would most children. An average U.S. man who is 5'9" is likely to be knocked down by about 39% of vehicles today. In 2002, that number would have been 29%. Not only are the high hoods on larger vehicles more lethal, but their bulkier frames can also block drivers' views of pedestrians. To analyze how these blind zones have changed, we used a three-dimensional scanner to compare sightlines in four of the most common pickups today: the Chevrolet Silverado, Ford F-150, GMC Sierra, and Toyota Tacoma, with their counterparts from the 1990s or early 2000s. The Silverado's blind zones have nearly doubled. The Sierras and the Tacomas grew by about 60%. The smallest increase was the F-150. Its blind zones grew by about 25%. And our overall findings match what we found in court records and heard from dozens of experts who reconstruct crashes for police and lawyers. One morning last year, Charlene McAllister, 76, set out for work at a child care center in Colorado Springs. "See you tonight," she called to her daughter as she left their home. As she was crossing the street, a Ram 1500 TRX, a pickup marketed for its off-road capabilities and fierce-looking design, was turning left. Ms. McAllister was not quite 5 feet tall. The pickup's hood was at least 4 feet high. It hit her, throwing her to the pavement. The driver later said he hadn't seen her, according to court records. They showed that the truck's large hood and side mirrors may have impeded his view. When Ms. McAllister's daughter Serena arrived at the scene, she saw her mother's hedgehog-themed backpack and red bursts in the roads, spattered with blood. Emergency workers had draped a white sheet over her body. The size of vehicles is far from the only reason that more pedestrians are dying, according to independent experts and industry officials. While vehicle safety is critical, blaming larger vehicles for pedestrian deaths overlooks systemic issues, including the design of roads, said Mike Levine, a spokesperson for Ford. Automakers say that new technology designed to detect and avoid pedestrians, including systems that would automatically apply the brakes, would dramatically improve safety. For example, Bill Gratz, a spokesman for General Motors, pointed to a recent study that found that GM vehicles with so-called front pedestrian braking reduced the frequency of injuries by 35%. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is pinning its hopes on automated collision avoidance systems. Such technologies are actively reducing the occurrence of these crashes and fundamentally shifting the risk landscape, said Sean Rushton, an agency spokesman. We view these technologies as the cornerstone of future mitigation strategies. But many experts say the technology is not a perfect substitute for drivers being able to view their surroundings directly. And tests by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which studies ways to make driving less dangerous, have shown that many a vehicle's automatic braking systems do not consistently prevent collisions. The owner's manuals for some of the most popular vehicles caution that safety technology can fail in a variety of common situations: in bad weather, at high speeds, if there are shadows on the road or its surface is uneven, or if a pedestrian is running, pushing a stroller, not standing upright, or the size of a small child. Today's SUVs and pickups promise more, more seats, more space, more safety, more power, more domination, more prestige, and for automakers, more money. They are the source of virtually all of the U.S. industry's profits, said Mark Wakefield, an industry expert. For nearly a decade, Ford and GM have said in their annual reports that their earnings depend on larger SUVs and pickups. The cost of making bigger vehicles is usually not much higher than it is for cars, because they're often built in automakers' most efficient factories, and the extra raw materials are relatively cheap. Yet customers are willing to pay much more for them. The average sticker price for a full-size pickup is $70,000, double that of a sedan. Some people pay more to soup up their trucks with lift kits that raise their suspensions. It's no coincidence that automakers have dramatically scaled back their production of sedans and other passenger cars in the U.S. Ford, for example, went from selling more than 1 million in 2017 to fewer than 100,000 5 years later. What used to be utilitarian vehicles for construction workers are now marketed to the American masses, with messages tailored to specific audiences. One common pitch centers on machismo. Automakers trumpet how some of their trucks have an aggressive appearance or a piercing glare. Other approaches emphasize the perceived safety of being the biggest vehicle around. You're the king of the road, said Frank Hanley, a director at the automotive research firm J.D. Power. At Ford, Nicole Gainey's job was to identify specific social and psychological groups to target. One was men who hoped to be seen as the neighborhood's hero, keeping everyone safe. Another group was women who viewed a roomy SUV as a way to be the community's caregiver, taking the soccer team out for ice cream. We're kind of in this American mindset that bigger is better, she said. In 2009, after a spate of fatal incidents in which drivers were crushed in rollovers, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration required roofs to be strong enough to support 3 times the weight of the vehicle. Many automakers responded by installing thicker A-pillars. James Forbes, who was a longtime engineering manager at Ford, said that after the company began installing the fatter A-pillars, he and his colleagues noticed that they were reducing drivers' visibility. The drivers were safer, but pedestrians were in greater peril. These potential dangers began attracting attention with articles in the Detroit Free Press and Consumer Reports. By 2022, the lack of visibility in large vehicles had become a concern for researchers at the Transportation Department's Volpe Center, whose mission is to identify and address problems in the transportation system. That November, the researchers met with leaders at the department and HTSAA. They delivered a stark message. Large vehicles with their big blind zones were increasingly deadly. They were killing hundreds of pedestrians and cyclists every year and injuring thousands more, the researchers estimated, according to attendees and meeting materials we reviewed. The researchers hoped that their warning would spur regulators to consider how to address the problem, but a senior NHTSA official disputed the data and argued that new pedestrian sensing technologies were already improving safety. There was just zero acknowledgement of the problem, said Angie Byrne, a former Volpe Center employee who was involved with the research. The meeting ended up with no plan for action. The U.S. government has paid scant attention to how the size of vehicles affects the safety of pedestrians. Federal regulators don't collect much data about the heights of vehicles' hoods, but we found one service that does, Expert Autostats. Our analysis shows a radical change in the makeup of American vehicles over the past 2 decades. Not only have many drivers abandoned traditional cars in favor of SUVs and pickups, but millions have flocked to vehicles with hoods that are more than 50 inches tall, like the Ford F-250 and Chevrolet Silverado 2500, whose ranks have increased more than 5-fold since 2022. To understand how a vehicle's size affects a crash's lethality, we built a statistical model. Our goal was to estimate how many fewer pedestrians, if any, would have died in a world in which vehicles had remained roughly the same size since 2002. We started with a federal database that contains a nationally representative sample of crashes reported to police from 2016 to 2024. We narrowed that down to those involving a single vehicle and a single pedestrian, and we added the data on hood heights. Our model then analyzed the degree to which different factors, such as hood height, weather conditions, time of day, and whether alcohol was involved, affected whether pedestrians died. Crashes are complex events, and the data we fed into our model doesn't capture everything about each incident. And of course, there's no way to definitively say what would have happened in an alternate reality where vehicles had not continued to grow large. But based on the best available data, the model reached a sobering estimate. The shift toward vehicles with higher hoods caused about 3,000 deaths from 2016 to 2024, and that estimate is conservative in many ways. For example, it doesn't include collisions that occur in places like parking lots, driveways, or private roads, which are not part of the federal database. Hundreds of pedestrians a year are estimated to die in such crashes, a number that has been increasing. Only in the past several years have researchers started exploring whether and how larger vehicles threaten pedestrians. The Institute for Highway Safety, for example, found that vehicles with large blind zones were substantially more likely to hit pedestrians when turning left. And here's another interesting article. Older adults are no longer staying in empty shell marriages, by Catherine Pearson. In 2021, after more than 30 years together, Alan Hickenbottom and his wife filed for divorce, but he still believes their marriage was a success. Their early years together were fun and exciting. They bonded over a shared love of books and art and a desire to do good things in the world. Mr. Hickenbottom, 67, worked in renewable energy for decades. His ex was a teacher and a school librarian. Then they threw themselves enthusiastically into raising their 2 children. But as often happens when the kids left for college, Mr. Hickenbottom realized that he and his wife were more like colleagues and roommates than romantic partners. 2 years of marriage counseling didn't fix things. Mr. Hickenbottom said, "I didn't want to devalue the life that we built, but that was not how I wanted to live." He might have another 40 years, he thought. What do I want to do? He recalled asking. Quick break, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mr. Hickenbottom is hardly the only 60-something who has decided to split up because of that line of existential questioning. Rates of gray divorce, splits among those 50 and older, have risen sharply in the United States, doubling between 1990 and 2010. Though those rates have stabilized since the pandemic, nearly 40% of divorces today occur between people 50 and older. While divorce rates have been dropping across age groups in recent years, the exception to that trend is among Americans ages 65 and up. The reasons are complicated, but it's becoming clear that some Gen Xers and baby boomers are increasingly unwilling to stay in what sociologists call empty shell marriages. These are relationships in which there is no real connection or vitality, where one or both partners are not happy, said Susan Brown, a professor of sociology at Bowling Green State University. Traditionally, such couples often decided to stay together for the sake of their kids, in view of economic stability or out of fear of stigma. Now that may be a thing of the past. This generation is living longer than prior generations, she said, and that may be changing the calculus about whether you want to stay in a marriage that is not that meaningful anymore. Longer lifespans are driving older people's decisions to divorce, said Justin Garcia, the executive director of the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana. We as a species are in longer relationships than our ancestors ever were, he said. Lifelong monogamy maybe meant a few decades. Now, though, there are couples who have been together for 50, 60, or even 70 plus years. That is evolutionarily unprecedented for our species, he said. At the same time, societal expectations for what marriages can or should be have changed. Baby boomers who got married relatively young, in part because that was simply the norm, are now living through a time when marriage is seen as a vehicle for love and self-actualization, said Claire Kampdash, a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. We're not just partnering based on this idea that someone's going to be the breadwinner and someone's going to be the homemaker, she said. It's possible, she added, that our collective tolerance for staying in just a so-so relationship is going down. I don't know how you say this. Ruchi, 58, hit that moment when her husband forgot her 50th birthday. That was bad. She didn't want a party or presents, but she expected she could receive maybe a card or a home-cooked dinner. By 9:30, though, it became clear that her husband of 20 years had simply forgotten, she said. You've put all these things aside because you're a mom and you're taking care of a family, she said, noting that though both she and her husband have always worked, she was the default parent to their two children who are now teenagers. Then you think, is that all I'm good for? When did I stop being a person? Menopause lent a kind of fury to her midlife turmoil. I actually thought I was crazy because I was irritated at everything, she said. Menopause is not just about losing estrogen, it's about losing tolerance, said Rebecca Thurston, the Associate Dean for Women's Health Research at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. You're doing all the things, she continued. You're taking care of the kids, you're taking care of the parents, you're taking care of the partner. At the same time, many of her patients ask themselves, is this really all there is? Taking care of people is a good thing. Of course, divorce is expensive, and older couples who are retired or nearing retirement have a lot to lose financially. Some choose to end their shell marriages, but not get divorced. That's the case for Gail Emig, 73, who separated from her husband of 40 years 6 months ago. They have agreed to avoid a messy and costly divorce, she said, instead asking their financial advisor to pay them equally every month from their shared pot. She's staying in the house they bought together in Sequim, Washington. He has moved into an apartment in California where the pair spent most of their lives. Their marriage, though not necessarily unhappy, had become stagnant, she said. Sometimes she could coast along, ignoring the emptiness she felt. Other times it smacked her in the face, like at their son's wedding. She had such a good time, she said, laughing, dancing, practically overflowing with joy, only to realize she had spent almost no time with her husband the whole day. Back at home, she often felt lonely, even when her husband was sitting next to her. I finally came to terms with this is what it was going to be if we stayed together, she said. The period following a late in life separation, though, is not always easy to navigate. Dr. Brown noted that while younger adults tend to recover within a year or two of divorce, older adults tend to take more of a financial and psychological hit. Her research has also found that men are more likely to repartner after a great divorce, partly because women tend to outlive them, shrinking the pool of available partners. But there's also evidence that women are less interested in remarrying after divorce than men. Certainly, online dating has changed the equation for older adults coming out of long marriages, offering at least the perception of options. According to a 2023 Pew Research Center report, 14% of Americans in their 60s and 12% of those 70 and older say they've used a dating app. Mr. Higginbottom dated like crazy after he divorced, he said, before meeting his fiancée, whom he has been with for 2 years. He and his ex-wife remain friendly. Since her separation, Ms. Emig said she hasn't been remotely interested in remarrying and takes joy in many types of relationships, particularly her female friendships, though she is open to finding a romantic connection. Comfort, laughter, sharing are what she still craves, she said. Ruhi, on the other hand, said she didn't know if she would ever date again. That may change with time, but she said she didn't feel the need to find someone else in order to feel complete. She's been saying yes to the kinds of work trips she once passed up and cooking spicier foods than her husband liked. A small act that feels huge, she said. There was a time when I was like, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? How is this going to work? What's my family going to say, she said. But she reminded herself, I'm a strong person. I'm a capable person. My family is very, very, very important to me, but I am more than my kids and my husband. I think I kind of forgot that. Here's a piece that's current in light of the fact that the British Prime Minister resigned today. 10 years after Brexit, the dismal verdict is in. This is by Philip Stevens, who is a contributing editor for the Financial Times. 10 years ago this week, Britain threw away its geopolitical compass and voted to quit the club of European nations that it had been a part of for more than 40 years. Leaving the European Union was supposed to allow Britain to take back control of its destiny. The word that really mattered in that campaign slogan was back. The trick was to look backward to reimagine the future. Not for nothing has Donald Trump's promise of the past decade been to make America great again. Brexit, as Britain's exit from the European Union came to be known, was supposed to be the vessel in which Britain could return to the decades after World War II, when Winston Churchill could pretend, just about, that Britain still counted as a global power. Boris Johnson, the most prominent face of the campaign to leave and later the prime minister who would negotiate the terms of Brexit, declared that breaking with Brussels would once more open the door to a dynamic cosmopolitan and global Britain. All Britain had to do was walk through it. He said in a speech, "We can see the sunlit meadows beyond." A decade later, the cost of that freedom, of the return, as Mr. Johnson repeatedly put it, of precious national sovereignty, is blindingly apparent. The vote to leave the European Union was a real cry of pain from a large section of the electorate that thought itself left behind by economic progress. The desperation remains. The sunlit meadows were a mirage. Beyond Brexit's heavy economic cost, the divisions over it ushered a new era of fragmentation and volatility into British politics, witnessed today with the resignation of Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Mr. Starmer was the sixth occupant of the office during the past decade. In the previous 2 decades, there had been just 3 prime ministers. For a moment in the summer of 2016, the Brexiters persuaded a small majority, the vote was 52% to 48, that Britain could throw out the austerity that had followed the 2008 global financial crash, reverse the hollowing out of well-paid manufacturing jobs, and trade freely and profitably on international markets. Immigrants who had flocked to Britain from Eastern and Central Europe would be sent home. Europe merely held Britain back, and to choose to leave was to believe, as Britons had before, that the nation was meant for more. The language of the Leave side echoed the arguments of leaders in the 1950s. Rather than joining the new coal and steel community in the common market, the beginning of the new supranational structures that would create the European Union, Britain reached for past glory. As the six founding members, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, were preparing to sign the Treaty of Rome in the summer of 1957, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a conservative, was in Bermuda with President Dwight Eisenhower in an attempt to rekindle the special relationship forged during the war by Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. There was a reluctance to admit that Britain was becoming a regional rather than global power. As a conservative foreign secretary in the early 1950s, Anthony Eden had spoken for the political establishment when he said that Britain's story and her interests lie far beyond the continent of Europe. Europe was simply too small an arena for British engagement. In fact, the retreat had begun in 1947 with the end of British colonial rule in India and continued through the 1950s as former Asian and African colonies sought independence, and the failure in 1956 of the Anglo-French military expedition to seize control of the Suez Canal was a watershed. But while Macmillan spoke of the wind of change blowing through the British Empire, the nation's political elites struggled to adjust to any lesser role for Britain in the world. Public opinion pointed in the same direction. Britain, voters were told, had won the war, and heads of state from all around the world had flocked to London for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. Why should it sign up to a European enterprise of defeated nations? The 21st century's Brexiteers were every bit as insouciant in their rhetorical disregard of Britain's relative decline. Nearly 4 years after the vote to leave, Mr. Johnson, by then Prime Minister, chose the Royal Naval College in Greenwich, once a hub of the British Empire's maritime power, to mark the conclusion of negotiations on the terms of Brexit. That 2020 speech, Unleashing Britain's Potential, sought to again conjure an earlier age of swashbuckling adventurism. His Secretary of State for Trade, Liz Truss, said he had her teams in place to strike new global trade deals. This is the moment for us to think of our past and get up a gear again, he said, to recapture the spirit of those seafaring ancestors immortalized above us, whose exploits brought not just riches, but something even more important than that, and that was a global perspective. Britain was on the threshold of a new golden age. It was, of course, a fantasy. Mr. Johnson got Brexit through, but as the conservative pro-European Michael Heseltine has often put it, this is the sovereignty of the man in the desert. The economy has stalled and trade has shrunk. Britain is poorer than it might have been. Its gross domestic product is at least 4%, but could be as much as 8% lower, according to independent calculations, while business investment is more than 10% lower. It added new frictions to the lives of Britons. New border checks when traveling to EU countries, stricter residency rules for living there, fewer opportunities for students to study abroad. Even just using a cell phone while roaming often costs more than it used to. There have been other costs, one of them a weakening of the glue between the nations of the United Kingdom itself. The referendum result was more a statement of English than of British nationalism. Majorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. Forced to leave, Scottish nationalists claimed stronger cause to promote their case for full independence from England, and the complex political arrangements for Northern Ireland needed to protect the Good Friday peace agreements between Irish nationalists and British unionists in the province have weakened the cause of the unionists. Rather than a newly independent Britain cutting a swath on the international stage, economic realities forced cuts in spending on foreign aid and diplomacy. The hopes among Brexiteers for a new Anglosphere, adding the English-speaking Commonwealth nations of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to Britain's special relationship with the United States, turned to dust, and Britain's privileged place in Washington was lost to Trump's disdain for traditional alliances. John Major, who was a conservative prime minister in the 1990s, fought off his party's anti-Europeans, has been blunt in his conclusion. Brexit has left Britain poorer, weaker, and locked out of the richest free trade market in history. The UK once reveled in being a leading member of an EU with 500 million citizens and the undoubted first ally of the US, the world's most eminent superpower, Mr. Major said in a speech last year. Today we know we are neither, and so does the world. Mr. Johnson's moment in the sun was also short-lived. Even as he spoke that day in Greenwich, the first cases of the new coronavirus were appearing in Britain. Within a little over 2 years, he would resign in disgrace for partying during the lockdowns that his government imposed. Ms. Truss would become prime minister for less than 50 days, and in July 2024, the Conservatives would be wiped out in a general election replaced by Mr. Starmer's Labour government. Quick break. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. When President Vladimir Putin of Russia launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was a salutary reminder of the lessons of several centuries of European history. An island Britain may be, but it cannot escape the facts of its geography. Its security is inextricably bound to that of its neighbors. When he became Prime Minister in 2024, Mr. Starmer scrambled to rebuild bridges with Britain's erstwhile European Union partners. He made some progress. Alongside Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany and President Emmanuel Macron of France, Mr. Starmer has been a leader in the coalition of the willing, buttressing President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine's government as the Trump administration drastically cut American military aid to Kyiv. Together with European partners, Mr. Starmer also acted as a brake on the White House's attempts to insist on a peace deal that would, in effect, hand Mr. Putin a victory. On the economic front, the Prime Minister negotiated with Brussels to strip away some of the more nonsensical obstacles thrown up by Brexit to free trade, student exchanges, and energy cooperation. He also sought to participate in the European Union's burgeoning program for collective defense procurement. There's an irony here. Many in the Brexit camp saw Britain's close relationship with the U.S. as an alternative to its European connections. But Trump has turned away from all of his transatlantic partners, Britain included. One senior advisor to Mr. Starmer told me that Trump was pushing Starmer further toward Europe. The Prime Minister seemed to say as much himself in April, saying at a news conference that renewing closer relations with Europe would mean a partnership for the dangerous world that we must navigate together. A summit with EU leaders, part of this reset, was planned for July, but postponed after his resignation today. With public sentiment now fairly firmly settled in Brexit regret, some pro-European politicians have started to make a case for rejoining. But Mr. Starmer, loath to lose more voters to Nigel Farage's anti-immigrant Reform Party, which consistently tops voting intention polls, continued to tread warily. His resignation had no direct connection to his European policy, but it spoke to the post-Brexit tide of populism in the nation's politics. The Prime Minister fell because of fears within his own party that his unpopularity was ceding traditional labor ground among blue-collar workers to the far right and still pro-Brexit reform. In any case, there's no certainty of an easy route back into Europe for Britain. Opinion polls point to a majority of Britons believing Brexit was a mistake, but do not yet point to a public clamor to overturn the result. Leaving the European took 4 years of intense, often acrimonious negotiation. Rejoining could well take longer, particularly since, after the unwanted upheaval of Brexit, Britain's former partners would have their own conditions for resuming the relationship. And many of the popular resentments toward elites at the heart of Brexit still fester, finding new expression in Reform and Mr. Farage, who blames the split's failures on its implementation. As different as the circumstances and characters on either side of the Atlantic were, there was a shared story in these epochal statements of national independence, that is, Brexit and MAGA. Both were populist revolts against ruling elites. Stop the world, voters declared. We want to get off. America is not Britain. Even if American power is now contested by China and other rising nations in the global south, the occupant of the White House still leads the world's preeminent nation and has at his disposal unparalleled military might. But Trump, in his second term, watching America's old allies deserted in the war against Iran, is beginning to count the costs of his disdain for the international order that was established by the U.S. after World War II. Taking back control left Britain alone. Making America great again may yet come to mean the same thing for America. And here's an essay by David French, who you will remember is an attorney. It's called A Malicious Chapter in the History of American Justice. An unusual tweet caught my eye last week. It was from Josh Gerstein, Politico's senior legal affairs reporter, and it said this: new in capital letters. Trump administration takes rare step to quell controversy over prosecutorial misconduct in dropped criminal case against Chicago area anti-ICE protesters. Feds won't fight defense demand to pay bill for activists' legal fees. Here's why it's so notable. In our legal system, prosecutors rarely pay a criminal defendant's legal fees, even when the government loses its case. Defendants tend to be reimbursed only when they can prove serious prosecutorial misconduct. It's even rarer for prosecutors to agree to pay those fees. Experienced lawyers will read that tweet and know a single, simple truth. Something very bad went down in Illinois. Why, you might wonder, would I write about a criminal case in Chicagoland when the world is convulsed by so many seismic events? Last week alone, Trump catapulted to Iran. The United States bad reading. Last week alone, Trump capitulated to Iran. The United States cut some of its defense commitments to Europe, and Ukraine hit Moscow with what appears to be its largest drone attack of the war. We're living in a moment when every week seems to bring a new development of global importance. But the Chicago case is indicative of the fight for justice in the Trump administration. For every high-profile case that goes to the Supreme Court, there are dozens of other smaller cases in federal courts across the country in which the Trump administration lies, bends the rules, slanders innocent citizens, and otherwise abuses the legal system to persecute its political opponents. And that brings us to the story of the Broadview Six. On October 23, 2025, a federal grand jury indicted a group of 6 protesters, including current and former Democratic public officials, charging them with conspiring to, quote, injure a federal officer in his person or property. The indictment claimed that they, among other things, banged aggressively on the government vehicle's side and back windows, hood, and other vehicle body parts, crowded together in the front and side of the government vehicle, and pushed against the vehicle to hinder and impede its movement. The indictment also claims the defendants scratched the word pig on the government vehicle. The indictment was important enough that Todd Blanche, then the Deputy Attorney General, announced the charges, and they fit perfectly with the MAGA narrative that the real problem on the streets wasn't with rogue federal officers, but with out-of-control leftist activists, the all-powerful Antifa of right-wing fever dreams. To put this indictment in context, it was announced around the same time that the administration was debating whether to invoke the Insurrection Act to use the military to crush anti-immigration protests. In fact, the same day that Blanche announced the charges, Will Scharf, the White House staff secretary, wrote his boss, Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, warning against using the Insurrection Act. And it was just a few months later in January that Vice President J.D. Vance urged invoking the Insurrection Act after federal agents shot and killed Renee Good and Alex Pretty in Minnesota. But then in March, the strangest thing happened in Illinois. The government dismissed its own case. The government dropped charges against two of the defendants, and the Broadview Six became the Broadview Four. The government also dropped the felony charges against the remaining defendants. Here's where things really get interesting and a little complicated. As Eric Columbus explained in an excellent rundown of the case in Lawfare, the defense attorneys filed a motion asking the court for permission to see the grand jury transcripts in the case to make sure that the grand jury had been properly instructed about the law before it issued the indictments. The prosecutors, it turns out, had already handed the judge a redacted copy of the transcripts. In other words, they had blacked out key portions of the proceedings. This prompted the federal judge in the case, April Perry, to require the government to produce unredacted copies and to require any prosecutor who participated in the decision to redact portions of the grand jury transcripts to appear before her in person. The unredacted transcripts were damning. The judge found that federal prosecutors had behaved improperly in at least three ways. They'd engaged in the forbidden practice of vouching, in which prosecutors essentially tell grand jurors to trust them that the case is stronger than it seems. Vouching implies the existence of secret proof, but grand juries are supposed to make decisions based on the evidence put before them, not their personal trust in prosecutors. Prosecutors had also impermissibly spoken to grand jurors outside the jury room, an act that could place additional pressure on grand jurors to yield to the prosecution's version of events. And finally, prosecutors had dismissed from deliberations those grand jurors who had disagreed with the government's case. Once again, the prosecution was improperly placing its thumb on the scales of justice. To make matters worse, prosecutors had redacted all of this evidence. There was an obvious cover-up. The judge declared herself incredibly shocked and said that she had never seen the types of prosecutorial behavior before a grand jury that I saw in these transcripts. She then said words no lawyer wants to hear. She raised the possibility of sanctions for prosecutorial misconduct and for potential ethical violations, including lack of candor to the court. Moments later, after a brief recess, the government moved to dismiss the case against the remaining defendants with prejudice, meaning that the government can't charge them again for the same offense. The court immediately granted the motion, and a malicious chapter in the history of American justice came to a righteous end. But don't think for a moment that the Trump administration's corruption and incompetence were confined to that case alone. The Chicago Sun-Times maintains a database of criminal charges related to Operation Midway Blitz, the Trump administration's immigration crackdown in Chicago, and it is astounding. Out of more than 30 cases filed so far, 2 resulted in guilty pleas, 5 resulted in deferred prosecution agreements, that is, slaps on the wrist, and 2 are still pending. 24 other cases have failed. 20 were dismissed. Grand juries refused to indict in at least 3, and 1 resulted in acquittal. This is a terrible record in court, and the facts of the cases are sometimes egregious. In the most notorious case, a federal agent shot a woman 5 times, and the administration publicly accused her of being a domestic terrorist, then charged her with assault, only to dismiss the case after an overwhelming amount of evidence, including body camera footage, contradicted the government's account. The Chicago cases are collapsing just as the federal government is announcing a new round of criminal indictments, this time against protesters in Minnesota. Last Tuesday, for example, the Department of Justice announced that it had charged 15 members of a group called Direct Action Minnesota with, among other things, assaulting federal officers, interstate stalking, and interstate threats. We don't yet know enough to evaluate those cases, but one thing is clear. The federal government has lost the benefit of the doubt. Or, as Judge Perry said in Chicago, I do deeply believe in the presumption of regularity and that most government attorneys are doing the best they can to do the right thing. That trust has been broken. But there is a silver lining in the dark cloud. In Chicago, the Trump administration has blinked. It's not just refusing to contest the payment of attorneys' fees. U.S. Attorney Andrew Boutros, the same person who presided over these corrupt prosecutions, has changed his tune. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In May, he announced a series of sweeping reforms to his office's grand jury procedures as part of a remediation plan to prevent future misconduct. When I'm in my more optimistic moments, I think we'll look back at last year as the high watermark of Trumpism, when the combination of arrogance after Trump's victory and the inherent authoritarianism of the Trumpist project led to a unique period of state violence and legal corruption. And now, my optimistic self says, the justice system is reasserting itself. The combination of personal courage, legal persistence, and judicial independence is preserving due process and the American system of justice. But optimism is no cause for complacency. Federal prosecutors in Illinois may be chastened, but Todd Blanche, the man who announced the bogus prosecution of the Broadview Six in the first place, is Trump's nominee to replace Pam Bondi as the Attorney General of the United States. If he is confirmed, expect more vindictive prosecutions, expect more prosecutorial misconduct, and expect more federal judges and more American citizens to say, along with Judge Perry in Illinois, that their trust is broken. Why? Because the Trump administration is the nation's chief threat to the rule of law. And here are some letters to the editor. These are about the Iran war. Here's a letter from Corvallis, Oregon. The first paragraph of the agreement between Iran and the United States specifies, among other conditions, that the two countries will refrain from the threat or use of force against each other. But Trump has repeatedly violated this pledge by threatening to resume bombing if things do not go to his satisfaction. How can Iranians or Americans take our pledges seriously when our top leader repeatedly violates them? Another letter, this one from Southampton, New Jersey. For the ongoing peace talks to be successful, at least one change is desperately needed. Trump must be muzzled. The man who so desperately wants the Nobel Peace Prize is once again threatening death and destruction to the Iranian civilization and warning the Iranian negotiators that they will never see their country again if they don't reach a peace agreement, all during the actual peace negotiations. As things stand, these talks are doomed. A letter from Wharton, New Jersey. With respect to the litany of blunders associated with the Iran war, perhaps the biggest was the assumption of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel that Trump would remain a steadfast ally when the going got tough. Was it hubris or simply a lack of attention that led Netanyahu to conclude that he would be treated differently from anyone else who ever partnered with Trump? A letter from Los Angeles. Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana, criticized Trump's agreement with Iran with a tirade on X, ending with, "This is the worst foreign policy blunder in decades." Given the president's record so far, the worst foreign policy blunder in weeks would have been safer. Here's a letter from Tampa, Florida. Marco Rubio may have the requisite foreign policy bona fides to serve as Secretary of State, but his influence in the geopolitical arena has been muted. Despite an impressive resume, the seasoned statesman's role in U.S.-Iran peace negotiations has been eclipsed by a team of foreign policy novices. Vice President J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, the special envoy to the Middle East, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. The backgrounds of Witkoff and Kushner in venture capital, law, and real estate represent a sharp departure from proven diplomatic statecraft. Past administrations depended on geopolitical experts in international law, history, or intelligence, such as George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Not the Trump administration. cronyism and nepotism ruled the day. This lack of specialized experience invited a dangerous power imbalance at the negotiating table. Despite America's superior military, the Iranian delegation, with seasoned diplomats of all stripes, held a strategic advantage over the American neophytes. The end result? America's team got its clock cleaned. And now, on a different subject, this is in response to an essay by Frank Bruni. I read Mr. Bruni's essay and saw my dad and his brothers. My generation, I'm 80, did not really have warm and fuzzy fathers. Even though I was the girl kid, my father and I were friends, sometimes buddy, and even partners in crime. We installed a galvanized pipe sprinkler system, and he taught me to thread pipe. He showed me how to sweat a joint in copper pipe, taught me to fish, and yes, to clean the fish, and treated me like a human being. Dad, a senior executive in a national company, was one of my best friends while I was growing up. He told me to always follow my dream, not do what I thought my parents or anyone else wanted. He drove me to the church for my wedding. We talked, we laughed, and we cried a little. I miss him. And a few more letters to close out our time. This is in response to an essay called "The Assault on Science Just Got Worse." We all need to be alarmed by the proposed changes to federal grant management. As a physician scientist, I'm terrified. Biomedical research in the U.S. is one of our greatest successes. Funding from the National Institutes of Health contributed to 99% of the drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration from 2010 to 2019. One of the reasons for the success of NIH-supported research is the emphasis on investigator-initiated studies, support for ideas that are vetted and improved by peer review to make sure the most promising research is supported. The Office of Management and Budget proposal would change this approach and give political appointees the power to decide which grant applications would be funded. Can you imagine a MAGA appointee funding grants from a blue state or a woke university? Based on our work studying inherited eye diseases, we recently reported a finding that challenges one of the main paradigms of human genetics and opens pathways for finding new treatments for all genetic diseases. But would a grant application to support our work be rejected by an uninformed political appointee because it challenges existing dogma, or more likely because I wrote this letter? And do we even want to take that risk? And here's a letter about the Supreme Court. I agree with Ms. Gay's assertion that Black American political power has been dismantled with stunning speed. Republican moves to gerrymander voting districts across the South are a frightening throwback to a Reconstruction era that gave birth to Jim Crow. It's for that very reason that Black Americans must turn out to vote. One election is not enough. Black Americans must consistently vote in off-cycle elections as well as in state and local elections. Now is the time for Black Americans to lead the path forward like never before. Show America that your voice will be heard at every election and at every town hall. And if you're listening to this in New York on Tuesday, it's election day. So please be sure to vote. It's very important. And I think that's all we have time for today because every other article seems to be quite long. So you've been listening to a reading of articles and features on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I really enjoyed doing this, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. And I will talk to you next week. Thank you for listening, and get out and vote. Bye.